Thank you very much, Ilian. Mr. President, great to be with you. Thank you to the Center for Study of Democracy for having me here. I have to do a little bit of free advertising. When I first read the Kremlin playbook, it was really an eye-opening experience. I finally found in print what I had been thinking for many, many years as a government official. I said, wow, it's all in one place, and it's so excellently done. And so when I first met Ognian about 6 months ago in Washington, I said, anytime you want me to come to Sofia to be a part of your institute, to do any event, I'm there. Really, these guys have done groundbreaking work, and it is cited in the US Congress, in the House, and the Senate, and numerous other think tank reports all around Washington. So it's my privilege to be here today. I've been asked to speak a little bit about sanctions, and so I will, but I'm going to back my way into it because I want to start with a little bit of context, even if some of it may be a little general. So from my perspective, looking at Russian aggression, Russia's covert war on Western democracy, if you will, it has gone through 3 phases. The first phase, and each phase more or less corresponds with Putin's 3 terms as president. So you have the first phase, roughly 2000 to 2006, 2007, where Russia is waging a war on democracy and democratic institutions inside Russia, subverting the independence of courts, ensuring that opposition parties are fully co-opted by the Kremlin, and so on and so forth, taking control of media. The second phase, roughly 2006, 2007, we can pinpoint it more or less with the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007, lasting till about 2014, is a war on democratic reformers and democratic institutions in the so-called Russian near abroad. You have the invasion of Georgia in 2008, of course the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. The third phase of Russia's war on democratic institutions has been the last phase, and it is a war where Russia has taken this assault to the West, to its own turf, to attack Western democratic institutions in Europe and in North America. And so we simply need to be aware of that because that is the situation that we face today. And yes, it is to a large extent about us. Russia has exploited the very things that make liberal democracies attractive and prosperous and maximizing of individual and economic freedom in order to weaponize those very same qualities against us. Pluralistic political systems, open financial institutions and transactions, freedom of the press. All of those have been flipped on their heads in order to subvert our democratic institutions. And make no mistake, as General Gerasimov wrote in his well-known article from 2013, which I don't really ascribe the genius to this to him at all. I think it is not a Gerasimov doctrine, it is a Putin doctrine, but it is one that seeks to make use of all the various elements of state power to be able to weaken democratic institutions, to split the NATO alliance and the broader transatlantic community apart, and to delegitimize especially those institutions of the international order that have to do with the promotion of democracy and democratic norms. Those are the Kremlin's objectives, and it's important to understand that. Now, again, before I get into sanctions, it is imperative that I underscore that the first step that we need to be taking as Western democratic societies is to protect ourselves. It is defense and deterrence above all. And so that's the part that, as Ognian said, that's the part that is about us. And that is where we have any range of actions that we could be taking, that we are, generally speaking, we collectively are not taking, but should be taking to reduce those gaping vulnerabilities in our democratic institutions. And I have in mind things like what Ruslan said about the creation of a European-wide anti-money laundering regulator. That is crucial when you look at the way that Russia has used dark money through institutions like ABLV in Latvia, the Moldovan laundromat, Danske Bank, etc. We need campaign transparency. This is, above all, something that we need to do in my country. The millions of dollars in dark money that slosh around American politics are a 8-lane highway for foreign dark money to influence electoral outcomes in the United States. And not just Russian, Chinese, Iranian, Saudi, etc. Obviously, there's a military aspect to what we need to do. That pertains to, for example, the Baltic theater, also to the Black Sea theater, where we need a credible military deterrent. We need, in my opinion, to be sharpening the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that we have in the United States to criminalize not just bribe giving, but bribe taking, and hopefully to get our European partners to match us with similar type of legislation. Cybersecurity, of course, counter-propaganda, energy security, these are all the sorts of various actions that we need to be taking to reduce our vulnerabilities to the various different tools, because Russia has a very diversified and very sophisticated toolkit to undermine our societies. And so that's the first point I want to make. But in addition to this, when Russia employs aggression, whether it be military aggression or whether it uses its subversive tools like cyber attacks to undermine our core democratic institutions, namely elections, among other things, we have to also push back. We have to impose costs on Russia, because if we don't, we send the Kremlin a blinking yellow light that they can keep going with zero consequences. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? Subversive tools are cheaper, they tend to be more effective than military action, and they are usually difficult to attribute to the perpetrator. So, when we think about imposing costs, there are obviously military things we can do, but generally speaking, we don't want to employ military power against Russia for obvious reasons. And so sanctions have become sort of the standby tool by which we impose costs on Russia. Now, many people say, well, look, it's 2019, Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, we've had sanctions now for the better part of 5 years. They simply don't work, right? Why would you talk about sanctions? And my response to that is, to a certain extent, yes, you are right. Sanctions have not changed Putin's fundamental calculus in the Ukraine or anywhere else. But that is not because sanctions are ineffective, but because we have been absolutely myopic and misunderstanding of what types of sanctions would actually have an impact on the Russian Federation. And so the way I see it, we are applying a solution. If we take the analogy of a cancer patient, if we are applying chemotherapy, we are applying maybe 1/100th of the dose that would be necessary to have an effect. And yet, after 5 years, we look at the diagnosis and we say things are getting either worse or they're staying the same, so we must be applying the wrong medicine. No, there is a huge impact that can be leveraged with sanctions. It's just that we're going about doing it the wrong way. So, what do we need to do with sanctions to make them work? A couple things. First, we have to prioritize. If you look at U.S. sanctions on Russia, we have applied sanctions for everything from Russia's intervention in Syria, to its cyber activities, to its support for the North Korean regime, to its use of chemical and biological weapons, its subversion of our elections, its invasion of Ukraine. You cannot have so many different rationales for sanctions if your goal is not just simply to be punitive, but to actually change the Kremlin's calculus and how it approaches these issues. So you have to prioritize ruthlessly and select one or two issues where you hope to have an effect. I would submit those should be Ukraine and interference in Western democratic elections. But that would be a choice for policymakers. Second, sanctions have to be reversible. Again, if we're not talking about punitive measures, we have to impose sanctions that can be reversed when the behavior changes. So there's actually an incentive for the Kremlin to consider changing action. If they are simply, as a result of, say, the use of Novichok in the United Kingdom, a punitive response, and there is nothing that Russia can do to change what it's already done, then these sanctions tend to have an attenuated impact, and we don't achieve our goals. But most important of all, sanctions have to be consequential. We have so often in Western capitals conflated symbolic action with action that is meaningful. When I was sitting in the National Security Council in the United States, and I heard people at the table referring to the PNG of Russian diplomatic personnel stationed in Washington, and we were debating at the time how many to PNG, to declare persona non grata. Was it going to be 10? Was it going to be 20? Was it going to be 35? And people said, well, if we do 35, ooh, that's the nuclear option. That is really going to put a shiver down Moscow's spine. And I was practically squirming in my chair. Are you kidding me? PNGs of diplomatic officials do not impose any lasting costs. They are always, historically, if you look at the record, they are always reciprocated by a tit-for-tat response from the other side. So how is this in any way imposing a consequence? And yet this is exactly what European governments were galvanized to do after the poisoning of Skripal and the death of a UK citizen in Salisbury. Completely ineffective response. Another ineffective response? Sanctioning the GRU. I'm sure the GRU are shaking in their boots that their vast bank accounts in Western financial institutions are now going to be frozen. This is absolutely meaningless. It is a symbolic gesture to demonstrate to our publics that leadership is taking action, when in fact they're not taking action. So what are symbolic sanctions? Well, if you look at the types of, so far more or less sanctions have fallen into three categories. They've fallen into financial sector sanctions, energy sector sanctions, and defense sector sanctions. Those are the three primary types of sanctions that have been imposed. According to a study that was done by the IMF in 2015, these collective sanctions applied both by the EU and the United States have shaved off approximately 1 to 1.5% of GDP from Russia's economic growth. That is significant, but it is not enough to change Mr. Putin's calculus. Compare that to the types of sanctions that the international community, not just the US, but the international community as a whole, levied with regards to Iran. And just take the period from 2012 to 2015. During that period, Iranian GDP fell by 9% annually. Oil exports were decreased from 2.2 million barrels per day to 1.1 million barrels per day, half. And $120 billion in Iranian reserves were frozen completely, so the regime could not access them. Now compare that to the 1 to 1.5% of decline in Russia's GDP. Now I am not suggesting that we should impose a cataclysmic shock on the Russian economy, because clearly there are contagion effects for European economies, less so for the US economy. So we don't want to crater the Russian economy, but we need to create enough pain, I'm sorry to say it, yes, pain, for the Kremlin to think about changing its actions in, say, Ukraine. And so what are the options available to us? Of the three sectors, and give me a 5-minute warning or a 2-minute warning if I'm going on too long.
I give you a warning.
Of the three sectors that we have imposed sanctions on, I think we've done a good job in the energy sector because we have been targeting upstream and unconventional resources, right? Arctic, deep water, shale, and other types of unconventional extraction. We would not want, nor should we, target conventional oil or gas production because we don't want to create a supply shock in the market because that's going to hurt us, right? So that would be dumb. So right now we have smart energy sanctions. I think those should, by and large, stay in place. In the defense sector, there is scope for applying more robust so-called secondary sanctions, where we would sanction the buyers of Russian military equipment, not just the companies that transact, but the buyers. And I'm thinking here of the major players, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc. This, however, carries grave geopolitical fallout, right? If we're going to be sanctioning India for its multi-billion-dollar purchases of Russian military equipment, we're going to be sinking our bilateral relationship, we meaning the United States. We will be sinking our bilateral relationship with India. I'm not sure that that is where we want to go, frankly. And so that leaves us with the financial sector. And here is where I think the United States, through the power of the dollar and financial markets, has enormous potential to create a sharpened calculus for President Putin. And what I have suggested in my previous writings and on previous occasions is that we should consider imposing the types of what are called blocking sanctions on Russian banks that we applied to Iran in the earlier period that I discussed prior to Iran's agreement to engage in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the so-called Iran nuclear deal, right? Blocking sanctions would block all transactions by major Russian banks through the U.S. financial system. It's a step the U.S., by the way, could take unilaterally. I would hope it would be reciprocated and we could coordinate this with our European partners. But if, at the end of the day, we needed to do this on our own, we could. And with regards to Russian interference in our elections, it is our prerogative to do this, and we should be doing this. And what I have in mind is taking into account what I said earlier about the contagion effects on the global economy and particularly on the European economy. I do not recommend sanctioning all Russian banks from one day to the next. What I have proposed in the past is a graduated plan where we, for example, start with the 10th or the 15th largest Russian bank, and we work our way up a list in an iterative manner, perhaps every 3 months, perhaps every 6 months. The details are less important. But we send a clear signal that the longer there are Russian troops in Ukraine, the longer Russia is perpetrating cyber attacks on our election infrastructure, the more we're going to keep ratcheting up the pressure until, Mr. Putin, you stop. Okay, that's the proposition on the table. And for those who think, well, but haven't we sanctioned Russian banks? No. We have applied limitations on debt and equity financing above 7 days for most Russian financial institutions. The West collectively has so far sanctioned exactly one Russian bank, Bank Rossiya, which at the time was the 26th largest bank in Russia. We have not touched Sberbank, VTB, VEB, Gazprombank, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I'm not suggesting we target them all at once, but I'm suggesting we sharpen the calculus. Because if we don't, how can we expect Mr. Putin to change his mind? He spent $50 billion funding the Sochi Winter Olympics, which was at the end of the day.
Mike, on behalf of Mr. Putin, time.
Okay, one more minute. So we have $50 billion spent on the Sochi Winter Olympics, which was a vanity project. If Putin is willing to spend that much money on Sochi and on ski lifts, of course he's going to be able to withstand more pain to his economy in order to achieve geopolitical control of, say, Ukraine, which is a preeminent foreign policy concern. So the last thing I will say is, as we think about a more coherent policy of imposing costs on Russia, we also have to understand that our own policies to date have been extremely hypocritical and schizophrenic. We cannot at the same time talk about imposing real costs on Russia while, with all due respect to my German colleagues, we are pursuing a Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, whose sole purpose is to subvert gas flow through Ukraine. And we cannot hope to impose real costs so long as President Macron is traveling to St. Petersburg to drum up bilateral trade and investment ties. It doesn't work that way. And we cannot hope to have a coherent policy so long as my own president is claiming that we should be readmitting Russia to the G8. Either we are coherent and we understand what I said at the outset, that Russia is waging a covert war on Western democratic institutions, and we take appropriate action to defend ourselves and to impose costs, or what are we talking about?